The contemporary fantasy author Patrick Rothfuss created a character named Auri in his Kingkiller series, the first book of which is called The Name of the Wind. Auri is a young woman who lives inside the dark, steamy tunnels underneath a university town. She rarely ventures up and out of the under thing, as she calls it, and lives each day quietly assessing the happiness levels of objects in this solitary place. Broken gears, discarded furniture. She gently makes adjustments to their orientation or location when needed. Rothfuss titled his spin-off novella on Auri and her world, The Slow Regard of Silent Things. Auri imagines what it would feel like to be something other than human, and instead of just anthropomorphizing non-humans, she attempts to allomorphize them. That is, empathize with them as they are, their shapes, sizes, weights, temperatures, textures, etc. She tries to imagine being them. The phenomenological study of things, especially as articulated by Kant and Heidegger and Husserl, has long considered how to characterize a thing vis-a-vis its nature in and of itself, and vis-a-vis how we perceive and use it. Thing theory has also considered how a thing differs from the more specified, identifiable, proprietary object. Epistemological and ontological concerns populate such reflections, as do legal, economic, and complexly human questions of ownership. In what ways, for example, do I own my body and its parts, my child, my ideas? While Dante did not directly discuss the nature of a thing versus that of an object, cantos 24 and 25 of Inferno, I will argue, offer us numerous entry points to explore notions of thinginess in Dante's thought. Most notably, these cantos guide us to consider words as things that snap now and then into objects, as I will explain, and then just as quickly back into things. In thing theory, an object is an encoded entity that requires a subject or subjects to designate it as such. It can be thought of as something we conveniently agree upon, like a hammer or a chair. The thing, on the other hand, can exist in an amorphous place of possibility that exceeds or precedes an object. An object can lose its status as an object when it estranges itself from us, opening up to new identifications and interpretations. It then moves into the territory of thing. What was once a barn door, for example, now sits broken on the ground as a slab of chipped wood. Its function long gone, possible new uses bubble up as we gaze at it. It could be a table. This thing now speaks to us in terms of its form, materiality, age, value, and so forth. The barn door, qua barn door, that is, the barn door in itself, recedes from our view, and what was previously unseen within it, or and is not ontologically exhausted by its relations with humans or other objects, and Brian Latour might disagree. Things are things because they lack fixed identities. Take, as another example, the experience of seeing a tall, dark thing in the distance as you drive down a desert highway. Approaching it, it comes into focus. Oh, it's an oil rig. It is now an identifiable object. A thing is what an object is before we name it and define its utility. And a thing is what emerges when we are estranged from an object, when we see it differently or interact with it differently. Objects and things are continually alternating with respect to the viewing subject. It depends on your knowledge base, your perceptive abilities, your imagination, and also the context in which you interact with an object or thing. Recent scholarship in speculative realism, new materialism, and object-oriented ontology offer many new ways of thinking about objects and things. Bruno Latour's actor network theory and Graham Harman's interrogation of Latour's model are two of the best known approaches to interrogating the actor-acted viewer-view dynamic. Works in feminist theory, eco-criticism, and animal studies that intersect with the philosophical discourses just noted add the dimensions of empathy, gender, race, sexual orientation, class, economics, and social justice to their considerations. Ian Bogost, a philosopher who wrote a fascinating study entitled Alien Phenomenology, or What Is It Like to Be a Thing, in 2012, also co-edits a current series for Bloomsbury Press called Object Lessons, in which objects, for example, a shipping container, rust, a refrigerator, a sock, traffic, each get the extended, slow regard of a scholar's mind that traces it through bits of culture, past and present, here and there, and tries to get at both its thinginess and objectness, albeit without locating Platonic ideals. So a highly influential line of thought in current OOO, object-oriented ontology, is posed by Timothy Morton. He challenges us to imagine an entity so massive and so massively distributed across space and time that it is, in its entirety, barely locatable, barely comprehensible. He calls this a hyperobject in his 2013 book called Hyperobject: Philosophy and Ecology at the End of the World. The whole of the hyperobject dwells outside of our sensory and in many cases cognitive reach. In that sense, I would call it a thing. Yet once we know what it is, or at least its outline, and Morton's objective is to help us see this outline, name it and know it, it takes on the status of object. Climate change is Morton's hyperobject case study. It is a conglomeration of centuries of human actions and planetary reactions. We see its fingerprint in our weather patterns, migration, extinction patterns, resource scarcity, and what we predict the world and life on this world will experience in the future. It is the radiation and toxins in our bodies. It motivates us to take or not take certain actions. To alter the course of this particularly dangerous hyperobject requires an ability to face both the jumble of things that produce the hyperobject and the things that the hyperobject produces, things that, as they come into our line of vision and understanding, become real objects, like carbon emissions, melting ice caps, with which we need to contend. We are the protagonists of this global story, and it is our slow regard of silent things that will determine its outcome. And now, finally, I will do some slow regarding of Dante. The rest of my talk will consider one example of the thing-object relationship that emerges in Inferno 24 and 25, but predominantly in 24. As most of you here know well, more body parts are named in these cantos than anywhere else in the Commedia. Agamben, Esposito, and many other theorists have long discussed the biopolitical differences between persons and things, and when a body has an identity, when it is a property, and when it is viewed as just a thing. I will not go into their and others' reasoning here. Rather, I'd like to focus on one body part, the hand, that object thing that, when part of a living thief, partook in the sin of theft of object things. Now in hell, it forever oscillates between being bound, incinerated, and mutated into something or someone else's hand. The thieves' hands and whole bodies go from being their owner's familiar objects to being things that are never again entirely their own. They become lizard-like paws, or those of another sinner, or ashes, or absorbed into a limbless, slithering body, or momentarily nothing. And when Dante shows us through simile and imagery, what he shows us through simile and imagery, he mirrors in poetic and rhetorical devices. Even his choice of certain letters of the alphabet, as we shall now discuss, provides an opportunity for the reader to experience the instability of identity, property, and propriety. It is because of Dante's hand, quite literally speaking, that letters flicker between being things and being objects in these verses. In Inferno 24, verse 100, and now I will share my screen. This is not a PowerPoint, this is just a PDF. So in verse 100, the poet describes the speed with which Vanni Fucci bursts into flames and then ashes, only later to be rapidly recomposed. Ne o si tosto mai ne isi scrisse, com el sacesse e arse, e cener tutto convenne che cascando divenisse. The most common commentary on this terzina is that the letters O and I are the quickest letters to write, hence their function in a simile about speed. The letter I is certainly a quick stroke to make with a pen if you don't dot it, but a lowercase l, which does not require a dot, can even be quicker. Similarly, an O in early 14th century Italian hands, which would be Gothic or semi-Gothic with some Carolingian influence, takes a bit more effort to pen than a C, which is half an O, as O's were usually made calligraphically with 2 strokes, not 1. Why then are we certain that Dante meant the letters O and I? While Anonimo, Benvenuto, and others have claimed that this simile is original to Dante, Giuseppe Giacolone, 1968, noted that in medieval Tuscan, there were sayings such as non sai fare un O and c'è mancato un I. Those expressions, however, evoke the simplicity of form of these 2 letters, not necessarily the speed with which one writes them. Scholars have noted a variety of possible reasons for Dante's choice of this simile, regardless of whether he invented it or not. Some have noted how an O and an I recall the simple geometric shapes of a circle and a line, and might even anticipate Vanni Fucci's obscene gesture at the beginning of Canto 25, or Dante's placing of his finger over his mouth to shush Virgil in Inferno 25. Many have seen it as the inversion of one of Zeus's many human conquests. The woman Io, turned into a heifer by Hera, but able to communicate her name with her hoof by making an imprint in the sand that looks like the letter I surrounded by an O. Many also have noted that you can read the O and the I as the undone subject pronoun io, reflective of how Vanni Fucci and the first group of thieves undergo an internal undoing of the self. The latter group in Inferno 25 of thieves undergo exchanging of forms. Gabriele Rossetti even went as far as to propose that the O and the I recall the first and last letters of the Orsini family, as well as their coat of arms decorated, as one branch of it is, with an eel, snaky eel. So in addition to these theories, many readers note how the simile of the O and the I echoes one of the main themes of the Bolgia, which is writing. Writing that deceives, like the opening simile of the Frost writing, and the 4 equivocal rhymes within the first 13 terzine of Canto 24, and the opilazione che lega l'uomo in Inferno 24. There's also writing that actually steals, which is Dante's own admission to literary appropriation in Inferno 25, something that Eva del Soldato, who will be speaking later, has spoken about in another context so beautifully. Writing that is weak, the fumo in aere and schiuma in acqua, and Vanni's parole forbar disconvenevole. There's also writing that silences. Dante's use of the tace et nunc topos vis-a-vis his literary predecessors, and the contropasso silencing of Vanni and the other thieves, and Vanni's attempt to silence God, and of course Dante's silencing of Virgil. But if we look very, very closely at this verse, we might see one more thing. A student of mine, and I attribute this to a student of mine who was also a chemistry major, once asked if the O and the I, and now if you look at this over here, the O and the I might in fact be seen as a 0 and a 1 instead of 2 letters. And so he said, when he was thinking about this, that it mirrors how a person that steals something begins with 0 of it and then has 1 of it or more. Hundreds of years of commentary on this canto, and no one to my knowledge, and I would be happy to be proved wrong, no one to my knowledge has ever proposed that. Building on this idea, the sinner's contropasso in Inferno 24 has them going from an identifiable someone, an object if you will, into virtually nothing. ashes, and then back into someone. Inferno 25 adds more complexity to the equation, with sinners transforming into one another via these lizardy creatures. In a selection of early copies of the verse, which I'm showing you a few here, we can see how the O and the I were written in a variety of ways. So I just want to show you very quickly. I don't know how well you can see this on the Zoom, but you can see the O and the I, and this particular copyist made it seem like it's my, ne o sitosto mai is. Oh, there it is. Neo sitosto by nei, there it is, sorry. Si scrisse. And then here the O and the I, the O and the I, and many of these I's are not dotted. The O and the I, not dotted. O and I. And then this one is the one, sorry, I meant to show you, where it's a strange combining of letters. So neo sitosto mai nei si scrisse. So a couple of different options of this. And so sometimes we'll see the letter I dotted and sometimes not. And of course you certainly don't need to, but I just wanted to show you that, first of all, in these early manuscript copies, they are not capitalized, the O and the I, which I think is interesting as well. Okay, so getting back to this question, could Dante have had 0 and 1 in mind? Metrically speaking, the pronunciation of O and I makes sense. They each have 1 syllable in length and make it quite easy to read the hendecasyllable verse. If we replace these 2 letters with numbers, we might have a bit of a problem, because to pronounce O as zero or zephiromo, zephiro, zifero, many of the words that first emerged in the 13th century that come from the Arabic sifer, meaning empty, and the I as uno, so zero and uno, would add additional syllables if we were to read it that way. But the 0 symbol, especially when used as a placeholder, was also often called nihil or nullo in Dante's time. And if Dante had nullo in mind and truncated it to be pronounced null, as well as the uno to be pronounced un, the verse could then be read as ne null si tosto mai ne un si scrisse. I mean, it sounds weird to our ear now, but perhaps, effortlessly maintaining the 11 beats. As a bonus, there emerges a semi-palindromic structure between null and un, which to my eye is a graphic echo of the thieves alternating between being and unbeing, object and thing. Another bonus, although perhaps a stretch, is the fact that the Hebrew letter ayin also means nothingness and happens to be an anagram of the word for, in Hebrew, myself, ani. Thus, with the flip of letters, the unknown thing, the ayin, becomes a known object, the ani, and vice versa. Dante might have known this. What is more, the letter ayin in Phoenician is represented by a little circle, which is the origin of the Latin letter O. In Dante's Italy, the 2 letters O and I were written in a way quite similar, to the 2 Arabic numbers. And so here, I just want to show you, here's the number 0. We've got a couple to look at here, 0, 0, 0. Although sometimes, as you can see, a 0 would have a line through it in these early 13th century copies. Here we have copies of Sacrobosco's text and Alessandro de Villadei. The Sacrobosco text, by the way, gives us not only the terms cifra, and we can see this in here, cifra, and figura. There's some other words to talk about 0, nihil, but also the word theta, which you can see right here, or theta, or theka, which was also the name of the branding device used on the faces of medieval criminals, thieves, for example. It stamped a little circle on their faces. So speaking of small circles, some historians of mathematics say that the 0 symbol may have actually come in the West from the Greek letter omnicron, the first letter of the Greek word udon, which of course means not at all or nothing, in that regard. But there are many lines of thought about this, of it coming from India, where it was sometimes represented as a dot, sometimes as a small circle, and then through the Middle East into, through Fibonacci into Italy. So Arabic numbers were first introduced into Europe through Spain in the late 10th century as versions of Hindu numbers. And they were called apices, or gubar numbers, in 976 via the Codex Vigilanus, Vigilanus, and 999 by Pope Sylvester II, Gerbert of Aurillac, although neither included the number 0. So these were the earliest Arabic numbers, but they did not include 0. 0 first made its formal appearance in Europe, in Italy, actually, with Fibonacci, as I mentioned, Leonardo Pisano, in his 1202 Liber Abaci. And so here, the last two images I have to show you are taken from the Liber Abaci. By the early 13th century, the 0 was being used by merchants and mathematicians. And I have not confirmed this yet. I haven't been able to be in Italy for the last couple of years, but I want to find out if we know anything about how Dante may have written the symbol 0. So how people were writing 0 in Florence while he was in the government. I need to find this out. But he certainly would have seen it in one of these or other mathematical treatises, Fibonacci or these others, and heard it discussed by those working in commerce and even in politics. He would have likely known 0 quite well. And one clue is given to me by a historian of mathematics and also another historian of the development of number symbols and number words. In 1299, the Florentine government issued an ordinance making it illegal to use Arabic numbers in account books, given how easy it was to scribble one number and pretend it was meant to be another. Explicitly, as one document reads, how a 6 or a 9 could be read as a 0 or vice versa. Of course, theft is involved here. The speedy strokes of Dante's pen jump in front of our eyes as we read verse 100. Now, I'm guessing that's a coincidence, a 1 and a 0 and a 0. And the letters transform into numbers. They momentarily become estranged things rather than alphabetic symbols we take for granted as graphic signs, known and agreed upon objects. Just like the ambiguous metamorphoses of the sinners' bodies, their hands, objects into things, what were stable objects on the pages, the O and the I, destabilize briefly to become things and then reform into new objects, the symbols 0 and 1. With this change, we see anew the thief's act of going from not having to having, from having 0 of something to having 1 of it. We see anew the protean contrapasso blinking between the selfhood, the thief as the number 1 and as a known object, and the thinginess of annihilation, the flames and ashes of a 0. This undoing of identity, this counter-resurrection, is of course also echoed if we reverse the order of O and I to read Io. As Joan Ferrante pointed out, Inferno 24 is filled with terms of quantity and consumption, and terms for hiding and becoming invisible, we know. And my conclusion, my last few words here, when looked at this way, verse 100 challenges the reader to see differently, to recognize moments in which text fluctuates between object and thing and can actually enact a metamorphosis. The act of theft, whether of property, identity, or other, challenges us to think about what is ours and what is not, how we relate to ownership, even of something as familiar as our own hand, and the letters we read on a page. As Rothfuss's Auri turned abandoned things into loved objects, allomorphizing herself to understand as much as she could about them, Dante gives us an opportunity to experience the slippage between things and objects and question our relationship to our bodies and ourselves and the things in the world around us. Thank you.